to say that, oh, great. I didn't know that we were going to record. Yeah, so there's other outcomes that CBT can shift. We're focusing on crime, violence, and conflict related outcomes today, given the nature of PeaceCon. But if you are, for whatever reason, interested in shifting these other outcomes, there's other evidence on those as well. We can go to the next slide. Again, yeah, great. So just to say that there's a lot of open questions that we kind of want to dive into when we're thinking about scaling these types of programs to other contexts, which we're going to be able to discuss more with these panelists. But one bucket of questions is around understanding more deeply the mechanisms behind why or when does a CBT program work, and what program elements are kind of the most essential for us to be seeing those impacts, in part because CBT is often bundled with other interventions. Sometimes fully understanding what element of a CBT program is most important can be difficult. There's also a bucket of questions around program delivery. So those are questions like, does it matter the level of supervision of these facilitators or their exact training? Does virtual CBT work? How do we retain beneficiaries in a program that lasts potentially a year in group therapy sessions? How do you keep young men engaged in a program like that? Questions around the optimal frequency and intensity of CBT, and also just questions around how does this kind of programming compare to other psychosocial interventions, which might be lighter touch or easier to implement potentially. And then the final slide here is just a note on how JPAL usually conceptualizes or usually tries to think about adapting and scaling programs to a new context is through this generalizability framework, where we start from the perspective of asking ourselves really, what is the theory of change behind the program we want to scale? Why do we think that this program works? And then when we are ready to bring this to another context, asking ourselves if the conditions in this new local context will actually support that theory of change. If we think that there's local implementation capacity to deliver this kind of program, and if we think that the evidence base is really strong enough to see the same behavior change in other contexts. So with that, I think we can move on to kind of the panelist presentations, and we can stop sharing the screen. It might also be worth mentioning that my name's Amy and I forgot to introduce myself. I am a senior policy associate at JPAL Global, where I work on the crime, violence, and conflict sector, as well as our political economy and governance sector. I've also worked briefly earlier this year in Liberia with Johnson on his CBT program, and I'm just very glad to be moderating and having the chance to talk with all of you today. So we want to get into your panelist-specific presentations. And sorry if I was rushing through this, I just wanted to get to you guys. But I actually want to start with Chris Jaffe, who we have online, if you're maybe willing to speak to your program first to get us kind of kicked off.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you all hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Muted. Yes, yes, we
okay.
can.
You can hear me. Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you also for your interest in this discussion. I'm going to briefly share some information about the BAM program. BAM stands for Becoming a Man. About the intervention, the implementation, the scaling, and results. I'm going to try to do all that in 5 minutes. But first, I'd like to let you know that BAM has been implemented for the last 22 years by a Chicago-based nonprofit organization called Youth Guidance, which was founded in 1924. So what is BAM? It's a school-based group counseling, mentoring, and rites of passage program that improves the social, emotional, and behavioral competencies of male students in grades 6 through 12. So these students have often been exposed to traumatic stressors and face social, behavioral, cognitive, and emotional challenges. To briefly set some context about Chicago, so violence continues to rise and is at its highest level in 2 decades. We've been averaging near 800 homicides per year since 2015 and over 3,000 shootings per year over the last 3 years. Gun homicides in Chicago overwhelmingly affect African-American males aged 15 to 24, a group for whom homicide is the leading cause of death. So because of these realities that we're dealing with here, many people, they look at the challenges that our young people face and they see problems, they see only problems. And in BAM, we like to see something more. We often see the entrepreneurial spirit of a teenager trying to improve his quality of life. To work with young people that are facing these tough challenges, we have to meet them where they are. And we do. So we bring young men into a BAM circle, which is a safe and supportive group of 10 to 12 young men who meet weekly during the school day. They're going through a curriculum that blends CBT, youth engagement, and rites of passage work in the exploration of BAM's core values. To that end, youth guidance counselor Anthony Ramirez de Vittorio developed BAM in 2001 to respond to the need that he saw in the young men at Clemente High School on Chicago's West Side. He's trying to have a positive male role model to help them to develop their own sense of identity and what it really means to be a man. Not what you see on TV or in movies or hear in music, but what does it really mean to be a man? And we know that that deep work within the circle leads to profound changes in outcomes beyond the circle and even beyond the school. So right now, BAM currently serves more than 10,000 young men in 8 different geographies across the US. So we're in Seattle, LA, Kansas City, Dallas, Boston, DC, and also has recently expanded into the UK. BAM's overall goals increase psychological and social emotional well-being, improve school engagement and academic attainment, and increase utilization of safe and healthy behaviors. The program is highly clinical, so we run weekly 1-hour CBT groups of 10 to 12 boys during school hours following the BAM curriculum. So the curriculum is comprised of a set of core values. We do check-ins, stories, role-playing, team building, and video education. BAM also incorporates individual counseling services for young people as needed. The boys learn social cognitive skills, self-awareness, emotional regulation, responsible decision-making, and also social awareness. BAM is also a mentoring program, so BAM counselors are a consistent presence in the school. They're safe and trustworthy. They're also fun and cool. The program is entirely voluntary, so the charisma of the counselors is paramount to recruiting young people to join. BAM is also a systemic intervention, so BAM counselors are engaging principals, administrators, teachers, parents, community members in the program. Lastly, I'll say that the implementation of BAM is based in what we call men's work. So we require that all BAM counselors participate in their own ruthless self-examination prior to delivering the program to young people. So we train our counselors through an experiential process where they participate in lessons facilitated by trainers as if they were the students. This way they can model the core values instead of teach them because they've addressed these issues in their own life. BAM counselors typically have a master's degree in social work, psychology, or counseling. They have high youth engagement skills. They have an ability to navigate difficult adult relationships within a school setting, and have a willingness to participate in their own journey of self-discovery. How could we expect a BAM counselor to take a young man through a discovery of what's working and not working in their lives if the counselors haven't done that work themselves? BAM has also participated in 2 randomized control trial studies through the University of Chicago Urban Labs and a qualitative evaluation through Chapin Hall, also at the University of Chicago. Results of the 2 RCTs were similar, and in the second study, we found a 50% reduction in violent crime arrests for young men in BAM over boys not attending BAM in the same school, along with a 19% increase in graduation rate and a return on investment of $30 to 1. Our qualitative study revealed that young men develop a sense of belonging in the program that supports and influences the development of their identity, social norms, agency, and empathy. And I will pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Lauren, if you are able to speak to some of the CBT programming that you've worked on.
Just have the microphone.
Yeah, let's.
Thanks. Sorry.
Part of my contraction. Cool. So youth are often the perpetrators and the victims of crime. In 2018 and 2019, the South African Police Service reported that 29% of contact crimes in the Western Cape in South Africa was perpetrated by youth between the ages of 10 and 17 years old. Many of you may also know that Cape Town in South Africa is one of the top 10 cities for the highest homicide rates in the world. So given these high levels of crime and violence in the Western Cape, local government was interested in implementing a behavioral program to reduce violence in schools and to improve attendance in high school and improve learning outcomes for high school students, with the ultimate goal of reducing crime and violence in the Western Cape. And so the Western Cape Government, Department of the Premier, and the Western Cape Education Department and JPAL Africa partnered together and undertook a 2-year pilot program where we adapted a school-based cognitive behavioral therapy intervention based on similar interventions that JPAL had evaluated previously, like Becoming a Man in Chicago, Poder in Mexico, and Style in Liberia. And we ran this program over 2 years and named it Shukuma, which in isiXhosa means to move. The pilot project involved a multi-week program to help grade 8 and 9 learners develop socio-emotional skills. And so in school, they would sit through about 10 to 15 sessions, small group sessions with facilitators. These facilitators were young job seekers who were trained in the curriculum and were locals in the area. And so these sessions happened once or twice a week over 2 to 6 months. So the curriculum was adapted and created really by Chris and Yuria Hendrikse, who are both curriculum and educational experts. And the facilitators, were trained in the curriculum, but also were trained on how to facilitate these small groups in schools. So by the end of 2022, the program had been piloted in 46 schools in the Western Cape. So in the Cape Metro region and the Cape Winelands, which is a bit more rural, and reached about 2,500 learners. And really the hypothesis behind this intervention was that through the program, learners would develop social and cognitive skills, which would allow them to slow down their decision-making process in high-stakes situations. And the intention was to equip learners with the ability to better cope with their emotions, to boost their self-esteem and decrease potential violent behaviors. So really as JPAL Africa, our role was to do a level of process monitoring for the program. So we selected 29 schools out of the 46 to be part of this process monitoring phase. And basically we wanted to understand and assess how program inputs and outputs were being delivered and if they were being delivered with fidelity. And we also just wanted to learn as much as possible from the entire process. And so 4 notable project results was that firstly, there was a clear demand for the program or programs similar to this. And this demand was coming from school administrators, government officials, teachers, learners, and alike. Then through a triangulation of enumerated data collection, we were able to deduce that the local facilitators were a good fit for the program and for delivering the program in schools, and that the learners felt that the facilitators did a reasonable to good job at delivering the program. Then we also found, thirdly, that the learners really valued the space that the Shikuma program created for them in schools. And the facilitators valued the role that they would be taking on delivering the program. And then three important challenges that we came across throughout this process was, firstly, that schools often struggled with providing suitable logistical arrangements. That could be timetabling issues like venue issues. We encountered some programming administrative challenges. And lastly, there was high rates of facilitator attrition and churn. And this was mainly because the cohort of facilitators delivering the program was young job seekers, so those who were unemployed. And if they would receive a more permanent position, they would shift into that role instead of this temporary position that we were offering through the Shikuma program. So given these results, the Western Cape government committed to implementing an adapted version of the Shikuma program in fewer schools, but in more classrooms across the Western Cape in 2023. That's
Great, thank you. Next, I want to turn it over to Johnson, and then we'll go to Hunter after that.
Thank you very much. This mic will be on the issue. Yeah. I want to tell you more about the Network for Empowerment and Progressive Initiative, an organization that have been working on a CBT-based hardcore youth rehabilitation program in Liberia. And we actually call that program the Sustainable Transformation of Youth in Liberia. And I just want to add a little bit of context as Amy was presenting and talking about non-clinical staff providing these kind of therapeutic activities. I also was part of a generation of young Liberians who was actually impacted by the 14-year civil war. And through psychosocial rehabilitation, I was able to put my life together again. And since then, I dedicated my life to helping other youth do the same. So after 2004, NEPI got more involved in implementing psychosocial related activities, across the country. And then we came across some researcher, like Chris Blaman, who studied global conflict, who heard about our impact and wanted to see how we are actually getting over that. And they were able to actually run a randomized control trial along our program. But let me tell you more about the program. STAR is an 8-week CBT-based program, and we run this program 3 days a week in the group section, 3 to 4 hours a day, and then 3 days a week of follow-up activities. So it's a 6-week activities over the period of 8 weeks. And what happened is that in those sessions, we actually base our activities on real life situation with these guys. I should tell you about the issue of CBT. When you look at someone who attitude, or maybe their thought process, their attitude and their behavior is allowing them to get involved in those kind of inappropriate activities, you also have to think about what kind of solution can bring them back. And those solutions must be able to target those inappropriate thoughts, attitude, and behavior so that they can be able to put on more pro-social behavior. So that's the kind of method we use in our activities, speaking directly to the kind of issues that the youth are involved with. And speaking to youth, I'm talking about at-risk youth who are involved into crime and violence in the streets of Monrovia. And with some of the consultation we had and continue to have with government, this population have grown up to like 100,000 across the country already. And just imagine in Liberia, Liberia has a youthful population. 60% of those population are in the age range of 25. So our program actually target 18 to 35 to make sure that a lot of these guys are captured. But there are interesting things that you will learn from what this randomized control trial actually shows. Researchers found that STAR was able to reduce crime and violence by 20 to 50% after our intervention. And like I was talking about those interventions, after those group sessions, when the program ends 2 weeks after the group session, we also provide cash transfer to our beneficiaries. And in our initial pilot testing, cash was actually a measurement tool. We wanted to know what impact the therapy had on these guys and how effectively they can be able to use cash, either to do business, go back to school, change their location, and, and in so many different dimensions. But it was interesting to find out that 10 years after this intervention, these PR went back into this community and identify up to 98% of the target beneficiaries. And over 10 years, our impact still persisted over. And there was so much interesting evidence. They saw that the therapy was successful. But when you combine therapy and cash transfer, it was most successful for the highest risk guys. So that just tells us that among the at-risk youth, there is a subset that our program need to actually focus on, especially the group that benefited the most, from this particular intervention. And what does that tell us today when it comes to the policy route? It actually makes us to understand that we have a replicable model, which is style, that is evidence-based, cost-effective, and ready to be scaled. It is cost-effective in that the run survey also shows that the $530 that was used to actually process one of these guys, was able to help them avoid crime over a period of time. That cost was translated into $2.50 over that period of time, which make this particular intervention very, very cost effective or low cost for implementation for policy people who are looking for alternative, to policing or incarceration. That's another important part. But when we look at the evidence that we gather in terms of program design, it actually speaks volume. So one of those most important things was there's a need now to change our recruitment, strategy. Because if the research result actually pointed out that the program was most effective with the highest risk guys, we have to start designing means as to how we can target that group of people. And we were opportune to have getting in touch with JPA, who sent Amy in Liberia for 6 weeks, helping us to develop an intake survey. We need an intake survey now to be part of this model, so that when we recruit these guys, we can be able to use the intake survey to analyze the data to actually identify the most high-risk youth to be admitted into the program. So you can't just walk in the community nowadays and just see every at-risk youth to be someone who should benefit from the program when you don't know the level at which, their risky behavior is. So our intake survey will actually be speaking to that going forward. So these are some of the strategies now that we have put together. We have made sure that our model is big enough because it can actually be replicated in other contexts, as well as the at-risk youth population. We know that it is good enough with the kind of evidence it have shown. We know that the model is simple because it just has to do with recruiting, providing CBT, and these social reintegration strategy. And then at the end of the program, you provide cash transfer, just 4 activities. We also know that it's easy or very simple and cheap, given the cost that we just talked about. I want to stop there because there are other information we'll provide you during the Q&A session.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for also starting to touch on how evidence has kind of informed your program. And
Yeah.
I'll just highlight that the fact that there's a 10-year follow-up on this study is just very rare and nice to see. With that, let's turn it over to our other online panelist, Helke, if you want to talk about your involvement on the CBT program with police.
For sure. Thanks, Amy, and thanks everyone who's participating in this session. Great to see you. So I'll tell you a little bit about this pilot intervention that we're running in Mexico City. This is a pilot to provide CBT program to police officers, as Amy said. And this is, as we were mentioning in the beginning, this is one of the populations for which we don't have that much evidence around the effectiveness of CBT. There's some evidence for example, military forces or emergency first responders, but this is one of the first programs that is specifically targeting preventive police officers. And we are running this pilot together with the Mexico City Police Department. So I'll tell you a little bit about the theory of change that underlies this intervention. We have done a series of interviews with police officers to understand a little bit what are the causes of stress or anxiety that they're exposed to. And we find that basically they are exposed to a lot of traumatic events during the course of their policing career, including particularly for police officers, the exposure to physical danger and sometimes life-threatening situations just during the course of their daily life. We also know that being a police officer is a very stressful profession organizationally. So it is a profession where they're exposed to very long shifts, anywhere from 12 to 24 to sometimes 36 hours. There's also a strong police culture around, being very strong, not necessarily showing or addressing emotions. And this, coupled with the constant exposure to stressful events, can be a kind of a toxic combination. And finally, they're also, as all of us are, exposed to external stressors related to maybe issues with their family, things like COVID, where it was also a big thing in the interviews that we found. And this is leading to a higher than normal prevalence within police officers of things like post-traumatic stress disorder and markers for things like anxiety, depression, and stress. Then at the organizational level, this leads to things like them being absent from their jobs relatively often and without previous notice, a high level of resignation, also inter-police conflicts, so with their job partners or with their superiors, and particularly of interest to us, it may impact their decision-making, which can ultimately lead to conflicts with citizens, police misconduct, and excessive use of force. So this is kind of the factors that we're trying to address with this CBT intervention. And I'll tell you a little bit about the concrete intervention in a bit, but what we hope to see afterwards is decreased indexes of stress, of negative effect, and also improved physical health. So we would eventually, in a larger scale study, this has been just a pilot so far, also like to monitor biometric markers such as blood pressure, quality of sleep, and heart rate, to ultimately see better performance in their jobs reflected in reduced absenteeism or showing up late for work, reduced use of force during arrests, and then also looking at external things such as reduced perception of conflict within their family. So this is kind of, as I said, the underlying theory of change. So a little bit of what we have done so far, unlike the three previous projects that have been presented, this is something that is just starting to kick off. So we have done a pilot with 40 police officers. We are just now wrapping up our end-line data collection. And both before the intervention and after the intervention, we've also carried out a lot of in-depth interviews, precisely to understand some of the open questions that Amy framed in the beginning. So what were the elements of the program that were most attractive for the officers, or that they found were most impactful? Did the delivery mechanism work for them? And I'll tell you about this also in a second. And are there any complementary interventions? We also piloted a couple of complementary interventions related to breathwork and mindfulness that they found were also helpful in kind of digesting or making the CBT content more relevant. So the specifics of the intervention that we've carried out, this was made up of 8 weekly sessions that were about an hour and a half long. And the content of the sessions was mainly video material that was developed by Dr. Judson Brewer at Brown University for his Unwinding Anxiety app. So what we did was translate these videos and also add some references specific to police work. So the police officers were, they watch these videos in a kind of a classroom setting in smaller groups, 8 to 10 police officers. And then they went through a series of reflections, practical exercises, and a Q&A session with a police force psychologist. So this is someone that has much more context around what happens in the day-to-day life of a police officer. And the idea of the unwinding anxiety intervention is to help people identify anxiety and worry habit loops. So what things might be triggering these habit loops, and what reward responses that are kind of maladaptive rewards they have developed in reaction to these habit loops, things like procrastinating, excessive eating. So make them aware of these anxiety loops, and then try to identify strategies to break the anxiety loops. So this is where the police psychologists that were kind of managing the Q&A sessions were particularly relevant, because they could help them identify context relevant factors to moderate this stress. And then just to wrap up a little bit about the context of Mexico City that these police officers are exposed to, Chris mentioned Chicago has an average of 800 homicides per year. So Mexico City has right now probably a little bit less. We are around maybe 600 or 700 homicides per year, but that is coming up from a high point relatively recently in 2019, where there was almost 1,600 homicides per year. There's also a high incidence of and very low reporting rate of things like non-fatal shootings and violent robberies. So police officers are really exposed to a lot of stress in that sense. And they're also exposed to a lot of stress because state and municipal police forces in Mexico are the least trusted representatives of the state. So just their interactions with citizens are very conflicting. And in the potential for scale, the Mexico City Police Force is the largest police force in Mexico. There's around 77,000 police officers in different roles. Some of them are administrative, but we do hope that based on the results of this pilot, we can eventually scale to a larger intervention within the force that will also allow us to run a full-scale RCT to identify the impacts of this program. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. So now we want to go to questions, but I have 3 that we're going to start with selfishly. It's the privilege of being able to hoard the mic, and then we'll pass it over to the audience if you guys have any additional questions. So the first question I kind of want to pose to all of you, which is, we've started touching on this already, but I want to ask, how has research and evidence, either from your own evaluations or from evaluations on other programs, how has that research helped shape the design of your CBT programming or how you implement your program? So Johnson, I don't know if you want to start since you touched on this little.
Yeah, thank you very much. The research was very much good for us because there's always a saying that when your intervention is not evaluated, you seem to be flying blind, because like you keep doing one thing over and over and nothing is actually showing you that the thing you are doing is having a kind of impact, and maybe it's just the luxury of implementing programs. So this research was able to show us that we were doing something, and something very meaningful. One has to do with even the effectiveness just with the therapy alone was significant. And it also showed us that if you combine therapy and cash, that was even more, impactful. And not only that, it was able to make us understand that it's not every at-risk youth that this program is actually meant for. Though you can implement the program with a pool of at-risk youth in the community, but a subset of this at-risk youth will always be successful from your program. And that makes us to think that there's a need to actually target well. So in our community scoping, these are some of the things that we are doing. And it's not just about just targeting, but how well do you target? Because initially, or across programs, people usually maybe use form to do demographic of participants and keep those information into an Excel file and then carry on their implementation. But we feel like there is something special that needs to be done. If the program was effective for the most high-risk youth, how can we identify that subset of high-risk youth among the population of at-risk youth. That led us to changing our recruitment strategy to make it more data-driven. And we decided to develop an intake survey, through Survey CTO that will actually help us identify that subset of at-risk youth through data analysis and identifying them. That's one good thing that research have done for us. The second thing is that the research have also allowed us to look among the intervention and say, which intervention is something that we need to scale. So we have come to the point of accepting that the CBT and cash transfer is the model we should lead with. So that also came from the result of the research that helping us put our entire model into those perspectives.
Healthcare, Chris, do you have anything you would want to add on this question on how research and evidence has shaped your programming?
Sure, yeah, I can jump in. So I'll say that BAM was developed primarily through the lived experience of the program founder, coupled with clinical theory, the theories of which are supported heavily by evidence. I'd say that external research confirmed what we suspected rather than informed the program in advance. However, we often, we really like to cite the UChicago Consortium on School Research. They have a 2015 report, really to help us contextualize the work of BAM. The report was a synthesis of knowledge across disciplines on what young people need to learn and grow, and how we as adults can support them through that process during the appropriate life stage. I'll also mention that the scaling of BAM really wouldn't have been possible without the partnership of NERN, the National Implementation Research Network, who through their evidence-based approach to implementation science helped us to scale our intervention while maintaining fidelity to our evaluated model.
Thank you. Lauren, I know that you might have some reflections kind of following off of Chris's, just based off of how Shikuma was informed by BAM.
Yeah, so we, like I said before, we adapted the Shikuma program based on previous JPAL evaluations, including Becoming a Man, Poder in Mexico, Style in Liberia. And in 2019, JPAL Africa was approached by the Department of the Premier at our annual Evaluating Social Programs training to look into a behavioral program to reduce violence in schools. And so upon our research, we landed on a CBT type of intervention. And I think Amy touched on this before, but at JPAL, we use this generalizability framework when we're trying to understand if other evaluations can be replicated and adapted into different contexts. And this is typically what we do before the program design. So we looked at the local conditions, and if you can remember the slides that Amy showed, the local conditions, the lessons on behavior, and local implementation. And we try and see what we learned from previous evaluations and match them with the new context. So with local conditions, from Becoming a Man, as well as the study in Mexico, high levels of crime and violence needs to be prevalent amongst youth. There needs to be, the fact that youth need to respond automatically and impulsively to high-risk situations needs to also be present. There needs to be limited access to psychosocial support in schools, and limited direct mentoring among youth for this to be able to be translated into new context. Then in terms of lessons on behavior, I think the hypothesis is that through a program like Becoming a Man or Style or Poder, youth would slow down their decision-making process and respond more appropriately in situations. And so that's really what we were trying to replicate in the Shikuma program. And then in terms of local implementation, we spoke to a bunch of researchers who've implemented programs like this before. to identify the challenges they experienced, and try to figure out if we could overcome these challenges and how that would affect program design. So for example, with the study in Mexico, they experienced high rates of attrition of those who participated because the program was run after school. And so really when we discussed and brainstormed with our government partners about how to design this program, we were very honest about having the sessions happen during school so we could maybe avoid that kind of attrition of after school programs. Yeah, so that's really how we use generalizability to understand if we can adapt and replicate programs.
Hilke, I want to give you a chance to respond if you want to add to this. If not, we can go.
For sure. I'll just add really quickly that we have drawn on previous research in first responders and particularly populations that are suffering from PTSD, from exposure to conflict, to inform the design of this program. But also, we're kind of experimenting ourselves because we came into working with police officers through CBT because what we were trying to originally do was improve citizen trust in the police. So we found through research that we carried out in Mexico that the best indicator for this was one-on-one interactions between citizens and police and how citizens perceive those interactions. So then we started looking at ways of improving how police reacted during those one-on-one interactions and found that CBT had in other populations these results of improving decision-making and reaction in certain types of situations. So it has been very informed by research, but we're also trying to take it a little bit forward and draw this link between citizen trust and CBT for police officers.
Great, thank you. So the next question I want to ask is, what practical lessons have you learned from adapting and implementing CBT programs in new contexts, including how you've drawn on some generalizable lessons from research when you've brought a given program to a new context? So flexible on who wants to start tackling that question. Otherwise, I can pick someone. All right, I'm gonna pick someone then.
Okay,
Chris, do you want to start on practical around adapting and implementing CBT programs in new contexts?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it might be helpful just to start with talking about what my process is for cultural adaptation, which really begins with a sort of a general framework of group-based CBT inspired interventions. And we've used the word inspired before today, and I say CBT inspired because we don't often implement only CBT in interventions like this. So we incorporate other modalities as well, like motivational interviewing and trauma-informed care and social and emotional learning. I think that CBT is really adaptable cross-culturally, and the specific language with which you present the intervention takes the most care during adaptation. And I can talk more about that later or more in depth at another time. But I like to do a significant amount of independent research in person and virtually before I begin drafting the intervention. Like to hold focus groups, meet individually with folks that are working at NGOs serving the population that the intervention is intended to serve. Then when I have a draft concept, I work with local social work consultants in developing the most appropriate intervention. Ultimately, in all of the interventions I've worked to develop, I'm still a white boy from Chicago who has never lived in the areas that I'm creating an intervention for. And so, even though my life's work is in developing CBT-based interventions, I must rely on working in partnership with folks in the community so that the intervention is relevant. I try to keep that in the front of my mind, and as I ask for help and feedback, and I think that feedback loop is the most important part. We try out sessions with facilitators and young people, and incorporating those lessons learned into the final piece of what the curriculum is.
Lauren or Johnson?
Yeah, I will speak to those kind of elections from different aspects because we are still preparing for this big shift. But what have happened was that I was opportune to have been part of the Malago Foundation that took me through the entire year of preparation on the skill journey, the path to skill journey that help us actually see how we see our program today. And there are a few things that stood up from there as a lesson that we try to like adapt to our own, skill process. One has to do with how do we want to actually carry on this skill, identifying the kind of vehicles that are necessary for skill. And we know that that can be done through few different layers. You can either skill to the government organization, government, you can skill through international organization, you can skill through national organization, or the fourth pattern would be like you, the organization that have developed the model to actually be able to scale your intervention. And then the issue has to do with, we want to reach millions of people. Which vehicle will actually be better for us? This is a CBT program. It's not like a kind of health-related program where you are reaching large mass that government is well situated in doing. They already have the infrastructures in place. Is government ready prepared for a CBT program, or can we co-create together? We try to test that. So we are keeping conversation now with the government youth ministry in Liberia to see how best we can co-create this particular star model, because we don't feel like the government can do this alone because they don't have that capacity. Even if they will be subcontracting intervention to other institutions, how well these institutions are situated to actually carry on this work. And looking back at the evidence that the RCT have also shown, STAR will not really be relevant for the entire at-risk youth population. So we are still in that process. And some of the pieces of advice we are advancing has to do with, even though the government want to work with the cross-section of at-risk youth, we can help come in with our intake survey, maybe do the entire recruitment process, and that intake survey will be able to help identify the most high-risk youth that NEPI can work with. And the other population of at-risk youth, you can contact other institutions that are providing psychosocial related intervention to work with those youth. Another thing that stood out has to do with, is CBT actually work with the male population? Is it feasible for a female? Because those are some of the questions that come out, and I want to cross across that. If you look at CBT and the kind of connections that it has with thought processes, attitude and behavior, it tells you that every thought processes, attitude and behavior that leads to an inappropriate, actions must have a specific kind of intervention, because there is certain thing you want to change. So if you are bringing at-risk youth, both male and female together, some of these at-risk youth that are female maybe become sex workers, though they are at-risk youth. What do you want to change? Part of these at-risk youth populations are involved with crime and violence. What do you want to change? We feel strong that one intervention cannot change all of the different kinds of behavior in this population. So we have to be careful how we design programs. It's not because CBT work with male population in an at-risk, environment, so you should just take it and implement it with female. No, even structural wise, is the leadership in this institution are female, where female will be able to confide into them, with the kind of issues you're going to discuss. All of these things have to be put on the table so that practitioner and policymaker understand that if you are working with domestic violent population with this particular CBT model, doesn't mean that you can work with that same model with criminal related population. It don't work like that, because there is certain thing that needs to be changed, and the model should be designed to actually change those particular kind of variables to be able to achieve the kind of impact. So we are looking at that. when we are looking at the skill processes, another thing that came out has to do with NEPI will not be able to open offices all over West Africa. That is costly, fundraising wise, monitoring wise. So what kind of vehicle would be good for us? We think we can replicate our model through other institutions. So we are working on that right now with the Global Development Incubator in our regional approach, wherein first looking at countries that we want to work in. We are reviewing the crime data to see this country has a very high rate of criminal youth in the country, but they have a stable government. This other country has a weak government with a high rate of crime rate. Which country should we actually prioritize? And then we say, we are looking at reducing crime and violence. It doesn't matter if the government in this particular country is stronger or weak. The issue is crime and violence that we want to reduce to actually create safer communities. So that should not be a criteria for selecting countries. So that look at the pool of crime and the high rates of crime in this country to be a kind of criteria. So we are all developing all of these things. And our skill strategy has to do with testing one of these countries, because we are at the point now of selecting among these countries in the sub-region, regional Africa, a particular country. Some of our advisors were saying, let's try it in 3 countries. And we are saying, no, you don't have to be trying a scalable model in 3 countries simultaneously. You will have a lot of work to do, and trying to work on this model to adapt it to country context and all of these things. Let's use one country for now, over a period of 12 months, design this entire criteria, recruitment strategy, identifying organization, building the capacity of that organization in that particular country, and then replicate the model. Step back and see what went wrong, what needs to be adapted, and we take that model to scale across another 2-3 countries. And if it works, then you can start talking about extending beyond other countries. So these are the pieces that we really want to put together from the learning, and experiences we have from this fellowship that should help us actually shift, towards how we want our scale-up process to be.
Thank you. So I want to ask one final question, and I'll just ask Lauren and Helke to address them briefly so we can get at least 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So one last question, we'll start with Lauren. Where do you think there are open implementation or path to scale questions for adapting these kinds of programs to new contexts? So Lauren, if you could start and then Helke to close it.
Sure. I feel like I have a lot of questions in my mind, but I would really put them into 3 buckets. So there's a bunch of scale questions, and there's a bunch of spillover effect questions, and then there's a bunch of adaptation questions. So with the scale questions, we really, while we were running the program in the Western Cape, we grappled with the idea of having this program be sustained in future in schools. And so we thought about who the best facilitator of the model of this program would be. And we thought we would like to have tested whether or not teachers could have done this program, because that's like a very appropriate and reliable scale kind of partner. But we didn't have time to test this. And so in future, this would be something to think more about. In terms of spillover effects, one thing that we noted from the program was that the facilitators themselves, as young job seekers, identified a change within their own behavior whilst they delivered the program to young people. And so I think another question we would like to explore in the future is, how does the facilitator's life change because of this CBT program in schools? What happens to their labor market outcomes or employment outcomes and social emotional skills? How does that translate to the broader community? So yeah, those kind of like spillover effect questions. And then lastly, I think we would like to do more research on adaptation. So an experience from Shukuma as well was that some of the learners struggled to understand the concepts. And we wondered if this was because of language barriers or cultural barriers. And so in future, I think we would hope to go deeper into the terminology and translating terms appropriately for other contexts. So for example, the word integrity in English might not have the same meaning or be the same word for someone who speaks isiXhosa. So yeah, just like thinking through those kind of adaptation challenges, I think is something else that we'd want to research more. Yeah.
Okay, do you want to chime in?
For sure. Thanks, Amy. So just really quickly, I think for us, many of the questions are around relevance and also around scope. So thinking about whether an intervention that is designed for, let's say, a normal person that is not constantly exposed to a life-threatening situation is relevant for police officers, or if we should be looking at something that is much more tailored. And the issue of scope, as I mentioned, the Mexico City Police Force has 77,000 police officers. There is no way we can have them all receive one-on-one attention. So we're working mostly in group settings. And a worry for us is, are we exposing people to things that might be triggering for them and then not necessarily having the capacity to respond to whatever behavior or situation has been triggered. And also related to scale, will the Mexico City Police Department be able to sustain an intervention even in a group setting over the long term? Because of course, we don't imagine, police officers going through the 2-month program repeatedly, but they should be able to receive some kind of reinforcement or other type of mentoring that allows them, if we find positive mental health effects, that allows them to sustain those positive mental health effects into the future.
Thank you so much. So I want to turn it over to the audience. If you guys have any questions, or even if you just have broader reflections that you want to share, maybe about your own experience kind of adapting or scaling this type of programming, it's all over to you, or any questions that we have on Zoom. If there's no questions from the audience, we can check the chat. Sure. Okay, let's start with a Zoom question while you guys think. Maybe, yeah.
Okay. We have 2 questions that are somewhat related from Abby Nauman. She asks, in the trainer models where the facilitator is not a trained clinician, how do you monitor the services participants receive and ensure the facilitators do no harm? And then a somewhat related question is, how do you differentiate from CBT implemented by clinicians in the modified CBT that is implemented by non-clinician facilitators? And Chris has already started to helpfully answer those online, but if others want to chime in.
I was gonna volunteer Chris as well.
I'm more than happy to say more too.
Yeah, Chris, let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to focus on the balance between the clinical sort of complexity of the program and the education level of the facilitators. And as Abby put it, keeping an eye toward doing no harm. You really need to think about what are the outcomes that you're looking to achieve, and what can you afford in terms of facilitator before going in. I think that in best case scenario, we have clinicians doing this program, and clinicians are expensive. And so, facilitators of BAM mostly have a relevant master's degree in social work, psychology, or counseling, but BAM is a highly clinical program and requires a lot of clinical oversight. I think in comparison to Shukuma, which is implemented by some younger folks that are high school graduates without a clinical background, we've had to adapt on the fly to avoid the do no harm principle. And we have young people that are expressing their experience with deep trauma to people who are not fully prepared to handle those conversations. that Shikuma intervention was initially designed to be implemented by clinicians, but as happens all the time, the funding model changed. And so now we have to adapt the program model to fit the facilitator. So those are some things, to keep in mind. And I think, to Abby's other question, I think you really need to rely on clinicians to work to figure out what is the appropriate level of intervention based on who will be facilitating it. And you can stick to things that have a lot of evidence behind them that are still CBT inspired and CBT informed, like deep breathing, like I put some of them in the chat. Locus of control, mindfulness, positive thinking, normalizing, speaking about how they're feeling with peers and that sort of thing. And if you stick to those, some of the things you can have facilitators that have maybe less of a clinical background. Hopefully that answers your question.
Maybe we can see if there's any questions from the audience, or if there's other thoughts from the panelists on the question around facilitators. Is there something new?
Yeah, I'm just curious. I'm so sad I came in a little bit later. But if any of you are familiar with groups that are working with, for example, international development actors or humanitarian aid actors who are implementing projects, right, and actually experiencing a lot of trauma as a result, but then they're also managing teams, often very large teams of local staff, who if the sort of, let's say that the expatriated staff and the local staff aren't getting adequate sort of support and care, can actually be, kind of spreading trauma, spreading the harm that comes sometimes from being exposed to highly stressful environments, all the things that you've been talking about up until now, repeated attacks on compounds, highly stressful environments, not adequate breaks. Didn't sound from the bits that I gathered that you guys are working with this population, but I'm curious, given your networks, whether there are groups that you're aware of that are doing this work.
Yeah, so maybe we can repeat this question into the mic so that people online could hear it, just in case you couldn't. But basically, she's asked if we're aware of programs looking at international development workers who are maybe exposed to highly stressful environments and may then be passing on their experiences with these traumatic situations to beneficiaries that they're supposed to be working with or teams that they're supposed to be managing. Does that kind of accurately summarize? So I think this would maybe most closely map to Helke's work in the sense that she's working with police officers exposed to these very traumatic situations. So I don't know if you're aware of other similar programs.
So yeah, we not necessarily in the context of international development as I think we would define it, but also in Mexico City, we are running a project with persons who have been exposed to gun violence, and they are in turn being mentored by former police officers. And so these former police officers are sometimes facing a lot of challenges dealing with their own trauma or passing on these types of things onto the people they are mentoring. So actually, this is just to say we have been exposed to this same challenge. What we have found is that then having clinical workers with the smaller group of mentors is a sort of solution to this. So we can't, as Chris eloquently said, afford clinical workers for the entire population, but we can afford them for the mentors who then, have better tools to work with their mentees.
Can I also jump in and add that just a plug for Heartland Alliance. So Heartland Alliance, who's a Chicago-based international NGO, but I'm actually leading work at Heartland around healing circles, and healing circles specifically for facilitators, administrators of programs working with people that are experiencing super high trauma in violent communities. So we hire licensed clinicians. They go out to the NGO and meet with the staff to process the difficult things that they're encountering with the participants of their programs. Right now, I know you were asking about international. That is based in Chicago, but we do have an international wing that I'm hoping to scale that intervention across, across the world.
And that's a whole kind of area of programming that I hadn't been thinking of. So we are at time. So I just want to thank you all for coming to the session. And if you have other questions, once we formally end this webinar, I'm sure the panelists that are here in person will be happy to talk more. And if you want Chris Jaffe's or Helke Madero's emails, I will be willing to connect you if they are so amenable. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me after as well to make that connection. Great.
Thank you.